Welcome to the Storypowers podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Jason Reid. Jason's a professional speaker and award-winning storyteller with more than 30 years experience creating powerful true-life tales for television, movies, and the stage. He's also a man who hates the ancient Greeks. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Reid. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I can see you've done your homework.
I have this goal that it's coalesced into an actual goal after the last few episodes I recorded, where the line I tend to get often is, I have never been introduced like that. So I keep trying to find something interesting that is going to catch my guest a bit off topic. So just so this is not hanging in the air, do you want to just explain to everyone listening, why do you hate the ancient Greeks?
Yes, well, it's interesting because, we treat so many things today as if they were brand new. But if you go back and you look at the ancient Greeks who did, obviously they almost invented public speaking. I mean, rhetoric was like a huge art form for them. Most of the key rules of persuasion and also storytelling go back to them. So, as somebody, several thousand years afterwards, trying to come up with something new, whenever I think I've got this new concept, I go back to the ancient Greeks talked about that first.
There's something I've talked about on the podcast before, but it's a similar pain of thinking you've stumbled upon something genius and then being told that that's not quite original. So I wrote and published a public speaking book recently, and the whole purpose of it, it's called Bear, A Guide to Brutally Honest Public Speaking. Can't remember the name of my own book. And then I was talking about this whole brutally honest thing, and then I stumbled upon the importance of being vulnerable on stage, and I said to someone, listen, I think there's something to this, the power of vulnerability thing. And they're like, oh yeah, the Brene Brown thing. I was like, who? It's like, yes, Brene Brown. So yes, I can relate to being disappointed that something genius that you think you've discovered has been discovered before.
Exactly. And, I should have been prepared for that, because for a while in my 20s, I was writing movie scripts for Hollywood, or at least I was writing them, attempting to sell them. I became neither rich nor famous. But one of the challenges is everybody thinks that their screenplay is totally original. But once you're down there, once you start reading and realizing there are just like literally hundreds of thousands of screenplays out there, almost all of them are based on a lot of the same ideas. So there is actually very little that's original. The best I think that we can do is to come up with a twist that's inherently our own.
I think there's the famous book, Save the Cat, and there's a few others all around the same ideas of what are the basic plots that most movies make. And I find that the surprising thing about that is, even if you know that a lot of movies are based on some variation of the hero's journey, it's incredible how you can still watch a whole, Pixar movie and not catch it that it's exactly the same structure every single time. And if it's too obvious, then you just think, I think I've seen a movie like this before. But if the writers have half a clue of what they're doing, you just don't spot it. Or it just feels, oh yes, this movie is working. I think the brain doesn't seem to, we've internalized the structure, but we don't seem to see it when it's literally flashing in front of our eyes.
Exactly. And this is even more important when we're communicating to persuade, whether it's in a talk or whether it's even in a documentary or a commercial, is if we don't do a really good job of the craft, of the little things, of getting people engaged, people start seeing the structure. They start seeing what's in it for us as the storyteller, as opposed to what's in it for them, the audience. So I think this is really, really key. Structure is hugely important, but you don't want people to see too much of it.
I'll jump on I want to talk about the structure, but you talked about your TV work before. So what I wanted to ask is, I believe you were writing comedy, right?
Yes. So I've written comedy in terms of writing monologues, writing jokes. I wrote some comedic screenplays. And then also in television, I spent a lot of my time actually writing and producing news and information programs. So reality type programs. When I say reality, I don't necessarily mean like reality shows, but again, sort of news, documentary, that sort of thing as well.
What we used to call reality.
Exactly.
because when I knew that some of your background was in TV comedy, and I was just curious about that, because what I had no idea is if you were a part of a group of writers, as I believe you were at least in the beginning of your career, were you in charge of just writing humor and coming up with jokes and funny one-liners, or were you more involved with the plot of those shows as well?
It depends on the show. The actual shows, specific shows that I worked on that were already established before I got there, were very much joke writing. So basically what you would have is 5 to 10 people. They would all be writing jokes. A lot of times, because it was a live show, the jokes would be based on kind of the news or what was going on that day. And then there would be a head writer or producer who would go and select which jokes they were going to run and in which order. So that's a very sort of collaborative medium. When I was writing the scripts on my own, they were mostly sample scripts for me to get work elsewhere. And the one thing I found interesting with that was actually I had an opportunity to work possibly on this big Canadian show. And the producer said, okay, we're going to need a couple of sample scripts first. So this is back in the 1990s. I think the two most popular comedies were The Simpsons and Seinfeld. And they're extremely well-written shows. And here's the interesting thing. They are so well-written that they're actually easy to write for. Situation comedies are such that once the characters are established, as a writer, you really just have to kind of come up with a situation and have the characters act as the characters would normally act based on their personality. And it was actually surprisingly easy, at least to do one for each. So that's one of the things that I found interesting. Again, the stronger your characters are, if you have characters and each character has a different personality, coming up with a situation in some ways is really all you need to do, and the characters do the rest.
So what you're saying is that writing the characters and perhaps character development is significantly more difficult than just coming up with situations that would be expected of that character to fall into or to behave in a certain way. Exactly.
And this is particularly important in television and situation comedies. The important thing is laying the groundwork of who are those characters and how do they react to certain situations. That's the really important part. And that's the part I think that requires the most skill. And then the rest of it becomes more of, okay, what's the situation? And then the writers getting into those characters' heads.
So you did a lot of TV work, and your experience is broader than I had understood it to be. Now, what I wanted to understand from your point of view, because I don't know that many people that are now doing what we do that have TV background, what would you say are the major differences between trying to write story in the types of formats that you were used to in TV and compare that to business storytelling?
Yes. So business storytelling, I think the big difference with business storytelling is the fact that you really have to view the stories as tools. One of the things that I see happening a lot, especially here in Canada and here in Toronto, where we have this huge speaking community, before COVID, there were several events, literally a month, where people would get up and speak, and some of them were like, 250 to 300 seat venues that would be packed every single night. And what I found with those stories is what was really missing was not the inspiration and not people being vulnerable, but it was sort of what's the point of the story? And particularly in business storytelling, it's really not about the story. It's about the message that you want to send. The story is really a delivery vehicle for the message. So here's how I get my clients to look at it. The message is what you're delivering to the audience. So think of it as an ice cream. And the story is the ice cream truck. And at least here in North America, I mean, the ice cream truck is like legendary, where, it comes down the street, it's really colorful, it plays a song, and suddenly everybody is excited about the ice cream. So that's really what your story is a way to get people excited about your message. It's that vehicle to deliver that ice cream cone, which should be a message that is clear enough that you can articulate it in a sentence. And that's where I think the biggest thing is for businesses is not just coming up with a good story, but figuring out, okay, what's the message we want to send first? And then what's the best story to send that message? And once you have sort of an overall brand story, you can then come up with other stories for different situations so that, if there's different obstacles to sale that you may have, you can come up with a story for each and every one of them to bring down those obstacles so that people end up buying into your idea or your product or service.
I love that ice cream analogy. And coincidentally, I think just a couple of days ago, I put out a video where I compared facts to ice cubes. They're shiny, they're hard, they have a very clear shape, but not for long. And if you put a few of them together and give it some time, it just becomes an indistinct wet mass. And then the story in this case is the ice tray. As much as the facts themselves might, get a little wobbly after a while, you can still see their shape and remember what they used to look like.
Yeah.
Interesting that the ice-related metaphors seem to come to storytellers.
And one of the things I really like about your metaphor is, particularly if you're doing a talk, whether it's a sales presentation or whatever, chances are you have a few points that you're trying to get across. And by having that ice cube tray, it helps people remember each distinct story, which helps them remember each distinct point. And if it was a fact or a point they were trying to remember, it would be challenging. But because it's in story form, it becomes much more easy.
Yeah, and it also makes it easy to use as props because you can carry around an ice tray and you get ice and an ice bucket pretty much anywhere you're going to speak at.
That's true.
You mentioned stories as a way to bring down objections. Now, I have heard you tell a story about. I'll let you tell that story, but it's a story, a method I found very interesting, which is the idea of using a story of failure from you to avoid other people making the same mistake. So I think this was the story when you told, essentially, when you had the chance to go into stand-up comedy, effectively, right?
That's right. Yes. So this was actually a very effective story for me. And it wasn't one that I started telling until I realized that I had that I needed this tool. So just to give you a bit of context, I had moved from general business coaching to specifically coaching entrepreneurs on how to speak about their business and do presentations. And one of the objections that I hadn't counted on, that I probably should have, was the fact that there's a lot of people out there that are kind of scared to step into the spotlight. They're actually scared to speak, get in front of the room. I figured that generally if they were coming to see me and I was talking about speaking, that they were already sold on the idea. And I thought, I realized the hard way, it's like, no, there's still these objections here. So I thought, okay, I need a story that's true that I can go into my past and talk about that will help overcome the objection of stepping into the spotlight. So I started telling the story about, in the early 1990s when I worked as a comedy writer on this Canadian show called Friday Night with Ralph Benberge. And I absolutely loved working on this show. With my first comedy writing gig. And I was able to sit in the audience because it was live, hear people laugh at my jokes. I'd go home. This is like in the 90s. So I had a old VHS machine and I would play it back and forth, the monologue, and hear people laugh at my jokes. I love this job. And the unfortunate thing was after the first season, because the ratings were low, everybody behind the scenes was fired. And I needed to impress the new producer to start writing again to get my job back. And the new producer was a guy by the name of Mark Breslin, who in Canada ran this huge chain of comedy clubs. And he was probably the most powerful man in Canadian entertainment at that time. So I knew I had my work cut out for me. Anyways, I had a whole bunch of jokes. I sent him the jokes to his office and I get this phone call. And I suddenly hear Mark Breslin, saying, "Hey, Jason, it's Mark Breslin here. Just looking at your material. You're a pretty funny guy." And I'm thinking, yes, he likes my stuff. I'm in. And there was a long pause. And then he said, "So how come I don't know you?" And I realized what he meant because he knew all of the comedians in Canada. And I wasn't a comedian. I was just writing because that's what I wanted to do. The idea at that time in my life of going out in front of a bunch of strangers and trying to get them to like me, was just horrible. Who would want to do that? Which is funny because it's what I'm doing now. But at the time, I was just like, Mark, sorry, I don't want to be a comedian. I just want to write. And he said, Jason, you can't create a career in comedy, particularly in Canada, just writing. He said, "I'll tell you what, we got new talent night at the club on Sunday. Come down. I'm going to be there, do a few minutes of your material. If you're any good at all, and I'm sure you will be, I will book you immediately and put you in the clubs." which is like an amazing offer from a guy like this. And I said no, because I did not want to get up on that stage. And there was this long pause. And then I heard him say, Jason, if you are not willing to step in the spotlight, you are not taking this business seriously and you're wasting my time. And he hung up. And I was like devastated. There went my dream job. But I was also very stubborn. It's like, no, I'm not going on the stage. So I ended up working behind the scenes in television, doing a lot of interview shows and actually booking a lot of speakers and experts. And what I started realizing was that the experts that got the attention, the experts that got the great clients, the experts that wrote the books weren't necessarily the best people in their fields. And, to use an example of this, I always say, is Dr. Phil the best psychologist ever in the history of the world by far? And
we hope not.
chances are probably not. Nothing against Dr. Phil, but he's probably not the best in the world ever by far. But he has made the most money and has the most fame by far because he chose to step into the spotlight. And when I left TV to become an entrepreneur, I started realizing that the world had changed and that Mark Breslin was a visionary, because when he had said, if you're not willing to step in the spotlight, you're not taking this business seriously. When he said that in the 90s, he meant the entertainment business. But I can tell you now in 2020 that this applies to all businesses, particularly if you're any sort of expert or consultant. If you are not willing to step into the spotlight, get up on stage or get in front of that room and speak about what you do, your competition will. And those are the people who are going to get the clients. Those are the people who are going to get the attention. And those are the people who are going to have the influence.
I think this is one of the cases that is being made on a regular basis, or was until a few months ago, by TED Talks. Because, who is the foremost authority in vulnerability in the world? Brene Brown. Now, is she really? I have no idea. But everybody assumes she is, and she was one of the better well-paid speakers in the world. Now, does anyone understand leadership better than Simon Sinek? I would probably think so, but he can write the books and speak, and that makes a massive difference. We don't know how things are going to shape out after we're out of this COVID situation, but the person who is willing to stand up and present whatever expertise they have, I think it's almost always going to be more valued, at least financially, and perhaps more recognized than the person who has the expertise but just can't communicate it or won't communicate it.
Absolutely. And I think there's an even larger issue now, particularly in North America, with the scientific community, because as we've seen a lot of science, and especially now with COVID as well, a lot of people are questioning science. And the scientific community really has to start doing a better job of communicating in a way that the average person understands, because if they don't understand it, then they're going to reject it. And that's what's happening. So interestingly enough, Alan Alda, the actor from MASH, is actually doing a podcast, and he's basically, in the latter part of his life, his mission now is actually helping scientists and researchers and the people who actually know their stuff be able to communicate it to the public a lot better, because I think that's becoming really important for everyone, regardless of what we do.
So how did you, because that story tells of when you made a mistake and then you use that story to tell it so other people don't make the same mistake you did. But you are a speaker now. So at some point you got over that obstacle of, I don't want to be on stage. I understand not wanting to be a stand-up comedian, which I think in some ways is significantly tougher than being a speaker. But did you have any resistance against speaking as well? Or was it just the stand-up comedy you didn't fancy doing?
I think what happened to me, I think the difference in part was age. And I also think it was, being in television, being around so many people who were stepping into the spotlight, I think some of that wore off. So, there's probably about a 20-year difference between, the me that didn't want to go on stage and the me that decided to become a speaker. So I don't know if there was any one particular thing, but I think, again, part of it was seeing that the people who were experts weren't, not saying they're not smart, but they weren't perfect. And I think that was also part of it too, this idea that if I got on stage, I would have to be perfect, whether it would be a stand-up comedian or a speaker. And, once I realized that that wasn't the case, then it became, I think, a lot easier for me to decide to do that.
I find that point very interesting, this idea of needing to be perfect, because I come from a Toastmasters background. And I have a lot of friends who are trying to get into the speaker business. And I've heard this from many of them, which is, I'm not sure I'm good enough as a speaker to be a speaker. And the more I looked into it and the more I studied it and the more I started, speaking in other arenas that have nothing to do with Toastmaster and watching other speakers, I came to the conclusion that it's the opposite. That the problem with most, I'm going to call them public speakers, as opposed to professional speakers, is that public speakers learn a whole bunch of stuff about technique that, one, is not that important, and two, unless they're absolute masters of that craft, makes them come across a bit robotic. So what I find when I see good professional speakers is that they just talk like normal people, and they have very good content. And, obviously there's stagecraft and there's other things to it. But what there isn't is this perfection of they never and ah. Their gestures are all functional. Every bit of movement on stage has a very specific purpose. And then people go they go this way, they go one way when they should have gone the other. It's like, no, stop worrying about technique on stage and just make sure your content makes sense and you can remember it and that's it.
Oh yeah, I can spot a Toastmasters trained speaker a mile away, as a lot of us can, if we're in that area. And there's nothing inherently wrong with Toastmasters, and it's nice to learn a certain amount of discipline and also get the opportunity to speak on a regular basis. But the challenge is, and you just heard me say there, is there are a lot of things that Toastmasters teaches that, while is somewhat important, kind of misses the mark. The mark is really being able to persuade people with how you speak. And a lot of times that comes from, again, things like being vulnerable, having a good story, having really good content. I and ah all the time. Like I would probably, rate very low on the Toastmasters scale, but I'm not trying to rate high on the Toastmasters scale. My purpose is always very different, and understanding, going back to stories being a tool, speaking is a tool too. So whenever I get up on stage or in front of a room, what I'm thinking of is not, well, don't and ah, Jason, and make sure you do this, that, and the other thing. It's, what do I want to show of myself? And particularly, what does my audience need to hear, want to hear? What do I need them to hear? Because it's really about your audience and also what you're looking to get from that speaking opportunity. And if you concentrate more on that as opposed to the other stuff, you'll find you're just a lot more relaxed and things just work better.
Yeah, I've described this to people as the focus is content, is not the delivery. As long as you can get the content out there and the content is strong enough, it's going to do the job. I don't think anyone with weak content, but flawless delivery, whatever flawless delivery looks like, is ever going to be considered a good professional speaker, because that's not what you're being judged on. Nobody's going to say, "Oh wow, a master of the stage." I don't think I've heard a single useful thing that whole hour, but wow, he speaks well.
And, I would also add inspiration to that. And it's funny because one of the things that I spoke on when I first started speaking, because I've had Crohn's disease and arthritis since I was a kid, is I've often spoken on, overcoming chronic illness and telling some inspirational stories. But I find there's just so much emphasis on inspiration now, and everybody's got a story. But what's missing is that content behind it. It's like, okay, if people are inspired by you, what's that step that they have to take? What are those concrete things? And what I'm finding, again, particularly here in Toronto, where there's this huge sort of amateur speaking community, and I'm plugged into that, and I'm also plugged into the professional speaking community, and sometimes they collide. And it's funny watching one of these younger speakers when I'm sitting with one of the older professional guys, and they're all going, well, yeah, this is a good story, but like, what's it about? What am I learning? And one of the other things that I sometimes do in my work is helping speakers market themselves. And with a lot of these speakers who become very popular, they win contests, they have viral videos, they come to me wanting to have that professional speaking career. And it's like, okay, well, what do you speak about? What's your content? What are you actually delivering? And there's nothing there. So,
or worse, there's I can speak about anything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. If you speak about everything, then you're speaking about nothing, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier. So I know you work with entrepreneurs and with business owners. And if I understand correctly, one of the things you help them do is to figure out, I think you've called that story of failure of yours. I've seen you call it somewhere, your 6-figure story.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I understand you help business and owners, entrepreneurs figure out their story. So I wanted to ask you about that process. How does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first question is always, who is your audience? Because the story is always about the audience. It's never really about you. And then the other question is, what's your message? Figuring out what message do you want or need to send to that audience. The third step becomes the structure and the clarity. It's like, okay, once you identify the story, how do we tell that story in 5 to 10 sentences? Like, really, really short. Because once you have that, once you understand the story arc and you get the right plot points, then the next step is to add the entertainment value. That's when you're adding scenes and dialogue and having characters and that sort of thing. So it's that process of really starting at the beginning, figuring out, okay, what do you want, beginning with the end in mind, having that tight structure, being able to, again, communicate that quickly, and then building that out so you have something that's, again, entertaining, that's engaging, that the audience will see themselves in, hopefully has some humor, some drama, all of that sort of stuff.
I know you do some of this work live because, I think I'm on your mailing list. I've seen you advertise sort of a masterclass type of thing. So where do you normally... So what questions do you ask to get that story out of them? Because surely there has to be a way to find that story fast. Otherwise, that masterclass would be problematic. But where do you think, or from your experience, where most of the stories are found?
Yes. So in my experience, at least the people that come to my masterclasses, I find that they usually already have some ideas of what their story or stories are. Sometimes I throw them a bit because, again, it's not always about you. It's really about what do you need the audience to know. So what usually happens is they have an idea of what their story is. And once they hear me explain the idea of storytelling to sell and overcoming objections and things like that, suddenly that story changes. So it may still be the basic arc, but what people learn from that story is different, because they realize they have to target the message of that story towards the audience and towards lowering audience objections. So again, I think people are storytelling machines. And I think one of the things that I really do is I give a lot of examples and I try to really break it down to make it easier on their brains to think of stuff. And once they do, once I get them relaxed and once I give them those examples, it usually comes. Sometimes people will say, okay, I've got this story or that story. And it usually, once we determine what the purpose of the story is, it becomes very easy to figure out which one of those we're going to do.
To get a bit more into the weeds of this, so there's this, some people will argue that there's dozens, if not hundreds of types of stories, but there's some broader categories. So it's very common to find some type of origin story or founder story. And then there is one that is more, about the value you add or the people you help or serve. And then some are more about purpose. Do you tend to find that when you're helping an entrepreneur or a business owner, does it tend to come out more often than not as an origin story? Or is it more about, the customers that they help or their purpose maybe?
Yeah. So my view is, and I really like the fact that you mentioned that we all have lots of stories. So what I find with a lot of story coaches is they're very heavy on the origin story or the brand story, and that's all that they do. But you're really shortchanging yourself if that's the only story you focus on, because again, people will have objections to sale, and having stories that illustrate points and overcome objections to sale in some ways is actually more important than the origin story. So it really depends on the person. For some clients, I will help them create 4, 5, or 6 stories. So we create an origin story, and then we look at different objections to sale, or the different, if particularly if they're a consultant or an expert, it's like, how does your view of this problem differ from your competitions, right? So if they say, oh, it's emphasizing X instead of Y, it's like, okay, we need a story about X. How did X work for you, or how did X work for your client? So really, for most entrepreneurs, for it to be most effective, you need sort of that suite of stories. You need the origin story, but you need to also be clear on what your message is, what your key points are, and have stories for those too. One of the biggest problems with the origin story is it tends to be about the entrepreneur rather than the audience. So the more you can get the audience to see you and make it universal when you're telling that story, the better that origin story is going to be.
Yeah, I think the typical approach or objective of that is, if you're pitching investors and their objection is you, why should we trust you? The origin story is very much comes into its own, because that's the only thing they want to know, why you should be the person that we're going to give money to. Because with entrepreneurs, it's common that whatever project you're starting is not the project you end up with.
Yeah.
So perhaps it doesn't make a great deal of sense to talk about the specific customers you help. But my experience has been that often just the smaller stories of something that gave you the insight, or something that a client realized, those sometimes you can tell in a minute and a half, will do a lot more heavy lifting for you than the grand origin story.
I totally agree.
Easier to tell. They're easier to tell as well.
Yeah, and you know what? That's what I've found over the years is, again, those smaller stories, those things that people can relate to, are the real gold. And in some ways, they're hidden gold, because those aren't the stories often that people are telling. They want the big, grandiose, I overcame this sort of thing. And they want to distill their entire lives into a story. And that's a very human thing to do, but it's not very effective. Where, like you say, the stories that you can tell quickly, the stories that are about maybe smaller but more universal problems are really where the gold is. So I would definitely stress that.
Because I tend towards humor and nonsense and absurd situations. What I really love is if I can find some really strange situation that happened with me, but relatable, that I can just get an insight. That's what I learned, or whatever. I learned that I shouldn't take myself so seriously, and then turn that into a more client-related point or business point. I tend to find those a lot easier to tell and a lot more interesting than sort of the case study that is told as a story.
Yes.
Also because if you're not very skillful, people see those coming a mile away. And after you heard the first, It's like, oh no, I can see what you're doing there. It's not pretty.
Yeah. I mean, one of my more popular stories, it actually, I really probably can't tell it here because it ends up, I use it to explain a lot of the things that I teach in terms of making your story entertaining. So it sort of kind of balloons sometimes into 15 minutes. But it's this story about the first big paid speaking gig that I actually had. And I end up, just before my plane is about to leave, I rush to use the washroom and I don't realize that I'm actually in the women's washroom. So I'm standing in the stall. It's like empty. And suddenly I hear click, click, click of high heels and all these women's voices. And I'm hearing me being paged that my plane is about to leave. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to miss my speech. I'm going to be arrested because I'm at the airport in the women's washroom. And I tell this story, and it's obviously not a story about, wow, how great I am. It's just about, a silly thing that, can happen to all of us. And it really lowers people's, what's the word I'm looking for here? People come in when you're a speaker and, sometimes you even see it, where they have the crossed arms and everything else. And like, oh, you're going to teach me? Well, we'll see what you have. But you're right. If you tell kind of an absurd story or a story with some humor or a story that's kind of self-effacing, that just kind of, lowers that internal block to you. If people suddenly become open to you because they realize, okay, this isn't a guy who's just going to come in and tell me how amazing he is. I think everybody's like really sick of that these days.
Well, we're back to the vulnerability point, but perhaps without the the waterworks. It's just, hi, I'm an idiot. I make mistakes. I'm not a special guy. I just happen to be here on stage telling you something. And I think, it's on the mistakes and on the failures that people recognize themselves more. You're worried about something, you're afraid of something, you've messed up. Because, and I've said this many times before, is I'm sure that if you're up there, head tall, talking about all your achievements, there might be one guy in the audience who's a bit of a jerk going, I totally relate to that. I'm also an achiever. But but most people are just thinking, you're a knob. What are you doing? Right? They won't like you.
Yeah. And, this gets even more important when you're selling, particularly if what you're selling is something that's embarrassing. So I'll give you a quick example of this. I worked with a lady who she was a financial expert, and she helped people through bankruptcy. Now, the challenge with speaking to sell when you're somebody who's an expert in bankruptcy is people are obviously embarrassed about it. They don't kind of want to be seen as somebody who would need someone like that. And, they're just probably not in a very good headspace about themselves. And this is one of the things that impedes action, keeps people from doing something. So I found out from her that the reason she really got into doing this work was when she was in her 20s, she ended up in this financial mess and was bankrupt. So we actually made that part of her story so that the audience could relate to her. But the important part of that story was, and when you're telling stories like this, is that was me then. And I've learned something from that. And now that I'm past that, I can also help you. Right?
Yeah, I've seen, I think it's from Sean Callahan's book, Putting Stories to Work. And he's seen, this is not his the explanation, but he's seen someone explain the story this way. Meet Bob, he's just like you. He has a problem that makes him feel bad. He's now found a solution and he feels better. Don't you want to feel like Bob?
Yeah.
Which is a beautiful structure. And I think in that example, it's you're Bob in that example. But yeah, no, I do think it's important. I've got a background in finance. I think it's very important if you're using yourself as the example of someone who messed up their finances. That story needs to turn. It can't be,
exactly.
And I'm still in that.
Yeah. And that's also the same for emotional stories. So obviously there's a lot of people out there doing work as coaches around, whether it's divorce or, leaving your narcissistic husband or whatever. There's a lot of people who are telling these emotional stories. And it's really important to be beyond that. Like if you get up there and are telling your story and you're still emotionally in it and you're crying and whatever, it doesn't come across, people feel sorry for you. And if people feel sorry for you, they're not going to buy anything from you. So the kind of weird thing that I sometimes do with my clients is get them to practice their story enough that it's no longer emotional for them. And then we get them to add very strategically pieces of emotion. And you need to do this naturally. This is sort of kind of an advanced thing where, when you're talking about something that has been difficult, to be able to change your voice in a way that illustrates that rather than, because once people are over it, and I've seen this sometimes with speakers, they may be telling this, horrible story about how their child died and they're smiling, and it's just like, okay, that doesn't work either. It's great that you've gone beyond the point where you're feeling emotional telling the story. Now's the point where you need to get in touch with those emotions just a little bit so that your body language and your voice matches in the story when those difficult points come up, matches those emotions so that you're congruent. That can be a challenge too, particularly when people get too quote unquote polished, is what's missing is that sense of authenticity.
Yeah, the congruence is a big thing, and again, this is one of the things that people talk about in places like Toastmasters that is very much on point. Your face. This is the source of one of the most misquoted statistics about communication. The whole, the words you use are only 7% of the importance of your message.
Yeah.
No, it's only 7% if they clash with your body language.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can tell the worst story in the world if you're smiling. People are like, okay, well, this is a joke. There's a twist coming somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that constant balance. I mean, speaking is a balance of being being prepared and knowing what you're going to say, but then saying it in a spontaneous fashion, right? It's kind of like acting in a way.
You mentioned that your story, or at least that story, can balloon up to about 15 minutes. So that's something I had heard you say before, and I wanted to ask again. You're doing a keynote, and these things tend to run 45 minutes to an hour. So what percentage of that hour, give or take, you just say are actual stories, and how much is just pure content? And how long are the stories normally? Because if you're doing a 15-minute story, I mean, best you get that one right.
Yeah, and this is sort of a bit of an exception, because this is a story that I use when I talk about stories. So what I will do is I will lead up. I will be talking about the importance of scenes, and I'll be talking about the importance of bringing in sensory details about how things looked and sounded, and bringing in humor and characters and all that sort of stuff. So this final story, one of the reasons it balloons to 15 minutes is I really want to give people a flavor of all of these things without it being too rushed, showing what you can do when you have the time to do that. So the message in that one is not quite as important as the way I'm telling it. So it's the way I'm telling it, which is really where a lot of the education value comes in. But to get back to your point about how long stories should be, again, if we view them as tools, part of it is, what kind of talk are you doing? What are the expectations? So when I first started talking on storytelling, I had a lot of theory, right? Like, okay, you have to construct it like this, do that. And then I realized, well, hold on a sec. I'm telling this talk about storytelling, but I'm not telling a lot of stories. And I realized that what I really needed was this mix of stories. I needed to show how to tell a long story. I needed to show how to tell a shorter story. I needed to show how to tell stories of different types and have examples of those. So that's why with myself, I usually have a story that's probably about 5 to 7 minutes at the beginning. And then I've got that story at the end that can be anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And then the stories in the middle tend to be very short. They tend to be illustrations of an example. So they tend to be maybe 1 to 3 or 4 minutes. So that's how I set up mine. People tend to remember beginnings and endings. So I like to have my best stuff again at the beginning and the ending. And since I'm a storyteller, those two things are stories.
I've also heard you use a terrible, not that it doesn't work, but terrible in the content example of inappropriate stories, of some guy explaining how a bidet works. And now, obviously, explaining the intricacies of using a bidet would clearly not be the sort of story you want to be telling on professionally. But where do you think that line is? I mean, what is the point that you're going over, and how much can you make fun of yourself, ideally, without saying, okay, well, this is not actually appropriate for a professional audience, for example?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to those 3 words, know your audience. There are stories that I wouldn't use for an audience of bankers that I would use for an audience of speakers. And not because the content is different, it's just because the style is such, it's probably not professional enough for the bankers. There are also humorous digressions I use in my stories. And I'm also very careful about doing that too. And sometimes what I'll do is actually gauge the audience. And this is something that comedians will do as well. My bathroom story, for instance, one of the reasons I end up getting trapped in the bathroom is, ironically, I'm speaking at this arthritis symposium, and my arthritis on this particular day is really bad. So I end up taking these painkillers just before I'm about to get on the plane so I can survive my flight. And I've never taken these pills before. And I described as the pills hit, like there being this wave after wave of pleasure. And depending on my audience, I may say, it was like having 12 orgasms in a row, I think, right? I wouldn't say that for a professional audience, but for entrepreneurs, especially, oddly enough, sometimes women entrepreneurs, saying something like that the right way will help sort of kind of lower those inhibitions down. And if I get a laugh, I go to the next level and I say, I think, because I'm a guy. What would I know what 12 orgasms in a row feels like? If I get more laughter, then it's like the next digression. Well, not even my best years. So having those things in your pocket and just being able to sort of seed them, and if the audience responds, it's like, okay, I'll go to the next level. okay, I'll go to the next level.
Mhm. Yeah, I can see how that story could spiral out of control if you start having the orgasm-like feelings while you're locked into the female bathroom.
Yeah, I make sure not to do it that way. And
Mhm.
this is where some things are really challenging to teach, because a lot of this level stuff comes from really understanding people and being able to read people, and also knowing how to take controversial words or controversial material and present them in a way that's not offensive. So I try and be very playful. And I'm also not, because I speak a lot to women, whether it's I'm doing association speaking or entrepreneurs, I tend to, because women are communicators, I tend to have a strong female following and a strong female audience. I tend to be very aware of that, and I try to avoid kind of a lot of the hyper masculine stuff that some of the business speakers, male business speakers, do. So because of that, because of the way I ease into things, and because I'm kind of playful, there's a lot of things that I can sometimes get away with saying, if I say it the right way, that somebody else saying would be offensive to people. But that's a sort of challenging thing to teach. You just really need to know how to read people and how to understand where different people are coming from, especially if you speak to a diverse audience.
And it's also the times we're living in. When I was still competing in public speaking, the speech that I won at stuff at a national level was a personal story about my first ill-fated marriage, and sort of the kicker at the end of it is that my wife was a lesbian, or turned into a lesbian, and I did it. It was fantastic. It was hilarious. And I was trying to tell the story to someone the other day, and I realized I'm not sure I can tell that story anymore. As much as it's true, and at no point I'm making fun of her, I'm always making fun of me in the story for not realizing it. I don't know if I can tell the story anymore, because now a lot of people could see, well, what's this is not an object of fun anymore.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you just realize, okay, well, it doesn't matter. I'm making fun of myself. There is but I have to be careful. And I remember I told that story once when I was practicing for the competition, and I had someone tell me, because the whole story involves a whole bunch of drunken shenanigans, and the person say, well, you keep saying about all these silly things you did when you were drunk, but I'm not sure that drinking that much is funny to everyone. And so you have to be hyper aware of how can things be misinterpreted or just interpreted in a way that is not yours.
That's right. And again, it gets back to knowing your audience. What I find interesting is so many of the comedians, I guess, of my era that sort of kind of came up in the 80s and 90s, them complaining about doing colleges, and college audiences are terrible and they're so politically correct. But my view is, it's like, well, humor changes and times change. It's like, the comedians in the 40s, by the time the 60s and 70s came around, people didn't think that stuff was funny. So if you're still doing the same stuff you did in the 80s and 90s and expecting an audience in 2020, a new audience, to react the same way, it doesn't work that way. You either have to look at changing your material for that audience, or decide, what, I'm just going to be speaking to people who are my age.
Yeah, it's this is one of the challenges if you're inclined to be humorous. And the other one, which I'm facing now, and I'm sure you're facing as well, is this virtual thing is brutal for anyone trying to be funny. I mean, if you're doing a master class and you have 6 people there, and you can just say, everybody, leave your mic on. Right, lock the dog in another room, but please leave the mic on. Fine, you get feedback, but you're doing it for 100 people. I've got a storytelling congress coming up, actually with Sean Callahan in October, and this is going to be beaming out to thousands of people. That's big in India. I mean, I'm going to humor to Indians with no feedback. So I'm looking at the humor and going like, not sure, unless I think it's an absolute slam dunk. I don't know if I can risk it, because I'm going to get nothing in return. Either way, I won't know if it's worked or not until later. So not easy trying to be funny these days.
Well, yeah, I mean, you bring up like a really good point about having a virtual audience is not being able to get that feedback, which is crucial to us when we're doing the in-person speaking. And the other difference, like you say, is also cultural too. Like, for instance, I found out that sort of that self-effacing humor, that, telling stories that don't necessarily look good on yourself, actually doesn't work for certain types of cultures. So for Chinese, Japanese, a lot of Asian cultures, that sort of stuff isn't seen as funny. I mean, they're very much cultures that are based on saving face, and when you're doing that, you're sort of doing the opposite of what their culture suggests. So you're right; it's really challenging. We tend to assume that what is of most importance to our culture is the same with all cultures, and that isn't true. So, sometimes we have to do our research, and when we don't, we have to be okay with sometimes failing spectacularly because stuff's not going to translate.
I'm mindful of our time now, so I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions. The first one, are you missing the stage already?
Oh, am I ever? I'm enjoying, the virtual stuff is interesting, and it's allowing me to sort of in some ways get back to some of the skills I learned in television, but I so love the energy of a live audience. I really miss it.
Yeah, I think that it will be a fantastic tool in the arsenal going forward when things normalize a bit. And for people that don't want to be a professional speaker, but have a young family, as is my case, I don't want to be traveling for half of the month. I'll be delighted if I can spend no more than 6, 7, 8 days away during the month, and anything else I do virtually. But just virtual is a bit painful. And finally, where can people find more of you?
Yes. Well, my website is powerstorymaster.com. That's all one word. And if you're interested in getting some free goodies, I actually also have a giveaway page, which you can find at jasonreid.org. And Reid is REID.org. And if you go there, you'll find my professional speaker storytelling tool, a couple of audios on how to tell better stories, and even if you're interested, a link where you can set up a free 20-minute call with me if you want to sort of work on your stories a little bit more. So that's at jasonreid.org. Send me your email address, and you'll get all that stuff for free.
Actually, when I went into your website the first time, I had 2 horrified seconds when I thought, oh crap, I have just plagiarized him. But then you realize it was Power Story Master, because my website is storypowers.com. And I was like, oh no, oh, it's not quite the same. That's fine. I'll put all the links to the website in the show notes, because nowadays no one can remember anything, and you didn't give the website in the middle of a story, so people would just forget 5 seconds after. Exactly. Jason, it's been an absolute pleasure, man.
Thank you so much for having me on, Francisco. This has been a lot of fun.
All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.